Hey, how are you doing winding down for the night? Or maybe just starting a long drive? If you're in the mood for a story, something that will really stick with you, then get comfortable. Because the story I'm about to tell you starts with a silence that was louder than any scream. Some nights silence isn't peaceful. It's a predator. On a quiet suburban street in Oak Haven, Colorado, a street where the only sounds should have been the rustle of autumn leaves, a new kind of silence was taking hold. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, punctuated only by the rhythmic sweep of red and blue lights cutting through a dense evening fog. For Officer David Miller, a cop with 20 years on the force and eyes that had seen far too much, this was the kind of quiet that made the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the screaming presence of something terribly wrong. He was the first to arrive at the home of Clara and Lily, a mother and daughter whose world had just been shattered. Inside the house told a story of chaos. A lamp was overturned, its light flickering like a dying heartbeat. Cushions were thrown from the sofa. And in the living room, Officer Miller found Clara, a young mother, unconscious and severely injured, but alive. A wave of relief washed over him, but it was fleeting, immediately replaced by a chilling question. Where was her daughter? He found her upstairs. Not crying, not screaming, but hidden deep inside a bedroom closet, behind a wall of winter coats. 4-year-old Lily was curled into a tiny ball, physically unharmed, clutching a small stuffed golden retriever as if it were the last anchor in a raging storm. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, and she was utterly, profoundly silent. This wasn't the quiet of a sleeping child. It was something deeper, something unnatural. In the weeks that followed, doctors would give it a name: selective mutism, a severe anxiety disorder triggered by extreme trauma. They explained it wasn't a choice, it was a cage. Her brain, in an act of self-preservation, had decided the world was too terrifying to engage with, so it shut down the one thing that connected her to it, her voice. The memories of that night were locked away, and her silence was the key. Psychologists talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, moments of trauma, so significant they can alter the very architecture of a child's developing brain. Lily wasn't just scared, she was fundamentally changed. And as the police investigation began, her silence became the biggest wall they had to climb. At first, the case seemed tragically straightforward. The initial suspect was a known local burglar with a history of similar break-ins. The evidence was circumstantial, but it fit a pattern. The case files were opened, the boxes were ticked, and it seemed like justice, while slow, was on a predictable path. But here's where the story takes its first chilling turn. Among the friends and family who rushed to the hospital offering condolences and support was a man named Richard, a close family friend, someone who had known Lily since she was born. He appeared devastated, his grief seemingly boundless. He brought flowers for Clara and a new teddy bear for Lily. He was the image of concern. Yet the lead detective couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The attack felt personal, too calculated, too violent for a simple burglary gone wrong. And then there was Richard himself. He was always there, asking for updates. His sorrow just a little too polished, his questions a little too specific. To everyone else, he was a pillar of support. But to the detective, he was a loose thread in a story that didn't quite add up. A seed of suspicion was planted, a dark and terrifying possibility that the monster they were looking for wasn't a stranger in the shadows, but someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The deepest wounds, we learn, are often the ones we cannot see. And silence is never just emptiness. It's a space filled with unspoken fear, a vault holding a terrible truth. The police had a theory but no proof. Their prime suspect had an alibi. and their only witness was a 4-year-old girl trapped in a world without words. The case was stalling, threatening to go cold. How do you fight for justice when the one person who saw everything can't tell you what happened? The law has rules, procedures, and a high bar for evidence. Compassion and intuition don't win cases, but as the legal system began to grind to a halt, it was that very compassion that would lead to an idea, an unconventional, desperate gamble that would either be dismissed as a circus act or become the key to unlocking everything. The police had a theory, a terrifying one, but no proof. In the sterile black and white world of the law, a detective's intuition is worth nothing. The case was turning into a legal checkmate, and Assistant District Attorney Sarah Jenkins was on the losing side of the board. Sarah was a fighter. Her office, cluttered with stacks of case files and underlined law books, was a testament to the battles she'd fought and won. But the case of Lily and Clara was different. It was a ghost. Every lead dissipated, every theory hit a dead end. And at the center of it all was the unmovable, heartbreaking silence of a 4-year-old girl. Making matters worse was Richard's defense attorney, a high-powered lawyer from Denver whose expensive suit and cynical smirk seemed designed to drain all hope from a room. He had just filed a motion to dismiss the case, his argument sharp and brutal. There was no physical evidence tying his client to the scene, and the state's only witness was, in his words, a traumatized toddler incapable of coherent testimony. He called it a tragedy, but not a crime his client was responsible for. The judge was considering the motion. The clock was ticking. The case was on the verge of collapsing entirely. For Sarah, it felt like failing not just the system, but failing a mother and a child. How could she look Clara in the eye and tell her that her attacker might walk free because her daughter was too scared to speak? Justice requires more than just laws. It requires compassion. And as Sarah stared at a photo of Lily on her desk, she realized that the key to unlocking this case wasn't going to be found in a law book. The idea came from an unexpected place. A child advocate on the case mentioned a program, something unconventional, something most old-school lawyers would scoff at. It was called the Courthouse Dogs Foundation, a non-profit that trains and places professionally trained facility dogs in legal settings to provide a calming presence for vulnerable witnesses. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only move Sarah had left. A few days later, she found herself at a quiet training facility outside the city. She expected a kennel of barking, high-energy dogs. Instead, she was met by a man named George, a retired social worker with kind eyes and a patient smile. And beside him, lying peacefully on the floor, with a soft thump, thump, thump of his tail, was Barney. Barney was a magnificent golden retriever, but he wasn't like any police dog Sarah had ever seen. There was no intimidating aura, no restless energy. He simply radiated a profound sense of calm. He looked up at Sarah not with the sharp alertness of a guard dog, but with a gentle, knowing intelligence. George explained, "People often mistake them for simple therapy pets. They aren't. Barney is a professional. He's been through thousands of hours of specialized training to work in high-stress environments like this. He doesn't bark, he doesn't jump. He's just present." George told her about the science, about how the simple act of a child petting a dog can lower their blood pressure, reduce cortisol, the stress hormone, and create a biochemical sense of safety. He told her about the real-world results. In over 200 courthouses across the country, he said, these dogs have helped thousands of children find the courage to speak their truth. Sarah watched as Barney rested his head on George's knee, his eyes still on her. In a world of legal jargon, aggressive cross-examinations, and cold, intimidating courtrooms, Barney was the opposite. He was a silent promise of unconditional acceptance. The defense attorney would call it a circus act. The judge might throw it out. The media could have a field day. But looking at this gentle golden giant, Sarah felt the first glimmer of hope she'd had in weeks. The key to unlocking the truth, she realized, wasn't about applying more pressure on Lily to speak. It was about creating a space so safe that she would finally feel she could. And that safety, she hoped, had a name. And his name was Barney. Hope is a dangerous thing in a courtroom. It can make you reckless. And for Sarah Jenkins, walking into the judge's chambers to pitch the idea of bringing a golden retriever into her case felt like the most reckless gamble of her career. The judge, a stern old-school jurist named Judge Marcus, listened with his fingers steepled his face, an unreadable mask of stone. When she finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning in the quiet room. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "this is a court of law, not a petting zoo. You're asking me to set a precedent based on—" What a feeling! The defense will tear this apart. Sarah's heart sank, but she held her ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the defense is already tearing this case apart. We've tried everything else. Psychology, play therapy. Nothing has reached her. This isn't about spectacle. It's about creating a sliver of safety for a child who has none. Just give me one session. Let me see if there's a connection." The judge was silent for a long moment, staring out the window. Finally, he sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "One session, Jenkins. In a neutral, non-legal setting. But if this turns into a circus, I'm pulling the plug, and I'll grant the defense's motion to dismiss. Am I clear?" It was more than Sarah could have hoped for. The first meeting was arranged in a quiet, sunlit room at a child advocacy center, a place filled with soft chairs and colorful drawings instead of witness stands and legal binders. Lily arrived clutching her mother's hand, her small body rigid with anxiety. She hadn't uttered a single sound in over 2 months. She was a ghost in her own life, her eyes darting around the room looking for threats. And then she saw him. Barney was lying on a rug in the corner with his handler, George. He wasn't looking at her. As trained, he made himself as non-threatening as possible, his head resting on his paws, his tail giving a slow, almost imperceptible wag. He was just a warm, golden presence in the room. Lily froze. She pulled back behind her mother's legs, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of her jeans. For a full 10 minutes, nothing happened. The adults in the room held their breath, the silence thick with anticipation. Sarah felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Maybe the judge was right. Maybe this was a mistake. And then it happened. It wasn't a big movement. It was a tiny shift. Lily slowly, cautiously peeked out from behind her mother. Her eyes were fixed on Barney. Barney didn't move, but his tail gave another gentle thump-thump against the floor. It was an invitation without pressure, a question without words. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Lily let go of her mother. She took one step, then another. She crept towards the dog until she was just a few feet away, her eyes wide, studying him. George gave a quiet, almost invisible nod. And here's the moment that changed everything. Lily reached out a trembling hand, not to pet him, but just to hover her fingers above his soft golden fur. She was testing the air, testing the safety of the moment. Barney, sensing her fear, let out a soft, gentle sigh, a sound of pure contentment, and closed his eyes. That was the key. By making himself vulnerable, he showed her she was safe. Lily's fingers finally touched his back. And as she did, something broke. A tiny sound escaped her lips. It wasn't a word. It was a shuddering exhale, a sound that had been trapped inside her for months. The tension visibly drained from her small shoulders. She sank to her knees and buried her face in Barney's warm fur. She didn't cry. She just breathed. For the first time since that horrible night, she just breathed. The adults in the room fought back tears. This was more than a breakthrough. It was a resurrection. We often think courage is about speaking up, about fighting back. But sometimes the most profound act of courage is simply allowing yourself to feel safe again. Barney didn't ask her for her story. He didn't need her to be brave. He just offered her a silent, unconditional sanctuary. A place where she could just be a little girl again, even for a moment. This wasn't just a girl petting a dog. This was a soul finding its anchor. Sarah watched a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She had her connection. Now she faced an even bigger challenge, convincing a court of law that this silent golden friendship wasn't just heartwarming, it was evidence. In the world of law, a breakthrough can feel like a victory, but it's often just the beginning of a bigger fight. Sarah Jenkins had her connection, a silent, powerful bond between a traumatized child and a gentle dog. But in the cold, harsh light of a courtroom, that connection was legally meaningless. Now she had to turn that heartwarming moment into admissible evidence, and the defense attorney was waiting for her, ready to tear it all down. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he was a master of legal combat. He filed an emergency motion to block Barney from ever setting foot in the courthouse. In his brief, he didn't just call the idea unconventional. He called it a manipulative theatrical stunt designed to emotionally prejudice the jury. He argued that the dog wasn't a comfort animal, but a prop. A furry, four-legged leading witness that would unfairly influence Lily's testimony if she ever gave any. He was smart, and his arguments were legally sound. The foundation of the American legal system is impartiality. A witness is supposed to give an objective account. How could a jury remain impartial when they're watching a little girl hug a golden retriever on the witness stand? Thorne painted a picture of a legal circus, and he was dangerously good at it. The hearing was held in a closed courtroom. No jury, no press. Just Sarah Thorne and Judge Marcus. The air was thick with hostility. Thorne went first, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Your Honor, the prosecution is asking you to turn your courtroom into an episode of Lassie. There is zero legal precedent for allowing an animal to accompany a witness to the stand for the sole purpose of eliciting an emotional response. It is prejudicial, it is improper, and it is a mockery of the serious proceedings of this court." He was relentless. He cited case law after case law. He was building a fortress of legal arguments around Sarah brick by painstaking brick. When he finally sat down, a smug smile on his face, it felt like the fight was already over. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. She didn't try to match Thorne's aggression. Instead, she spoke about science. "Mr. Thorne calls this a stunt." She began, her voice calm and clear. "I call it a scientifically backed accommodation. We provide accommodations for witnesses with physical disabilities all the time. This is no different. Lily's disability isn't visible, but it is just as real. Her trauma has physiologically rewired her brain. We have medical reports confirming that. The presence of a highly trained facility dog like Barney isn't about emotion. It's about neurology. It's about lowering her cortisol levels enough for her brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for memory and speech, to function." She presented the judge with stacks of peer-reviewed studies on the biochemical effects of human-animal interaction. She showed him statistics from the Courthouse Dogs Foundation, proving this wasn't a wild experiment, but a tested method. She wasn't arguing feelings, she was arguing facts. But the final, most powerful moment came when she looked the judge directly in the eye. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper, "the law is designed to find the truth. But what happens when the truth is locked inside a child Too terrified to speak? Does the law simply give up, or does it adapt? Does it find a way to listen? Barney isn't a prop. He is a key. He is the key to unlocking the truth. And without him, that truth may be lost forever. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Marcus stared down at the documents, his face impassive. Thorne was already shaking his head, confident he had won. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, the judge looked up. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "your arguments are well made. The risk of prejudice is real." He paused, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. "However," the judge continued, "the duty of this court is not just to follow precedent, but to ensure a fair trial. And a fair trial requires giving a witness a meaningful opportunity to be heard." And then came the plot twist no one saw coming. "I've reviewed the statutes," the judge said, "and while there is no specific rule for a courthouse dog, the law does allow for a support person to be present for a vulnerable witness. The statute does not specify that this person must be human." A collective gasp went through the room. Thorne shot to his feet. "Your Honor, that is an absurd interpretation." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge commanded, his voice like iron. "It's a novel one, I'll grant you. But the purpose of the law is to serve justice, not to be a straitjacket. I am ruling that the dog Barney can be present." He held up a hand to silence Sarah's sigh of relief. "But under very strict conditions. He will lie at the witness stand out of the direct sightline of the jury. There will be no petting or overt interaction once testimony begins. He is there as a silent, calming presence and nothing more. If this becomes a spectacle, Miss Jenkins, I will declare a mistrial so fast it will make your head spin. Am I understood?" Sarah could only nod, her heart pounding in her chest. She had won. She had pushed the boundaries of the law and found a crack of light. But the victory felt terrifying. The stage was now set. Lily and Barney would enter the courtroom. But the weight of the entire case now rested on the silent whisper of a 4-year-old girl and a single desperate hope that in the presence of her, the day of the testimony arrived, cloaked in a heavy grey morning. The courtroom felt different this time. The usual low hum of chatter was gone, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Every person in that room, from the jury to the press, knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. Either a historic moment for justice or a spectacular failure. The defendant Richard sat beside his lawyer, Marcus Thorne. He looked calm, almost bored, a smirk playing on his lips. He believed he had already won. This was just the final act of a ridiculous play, and he was an amused spectator. Then the courtroom doors opened. First came Clara Lily's mother, her face pale but resolute. And beside her, holding her hand, was Lily, a tiny figure in a simple blue dress. And walking silently on Lily's other side, his presence a shield of calm, was Barney. His handler George gave a quiet nod to the bailiff. The room held a collective breath. As Lily walked towards the witness stand, it was like watching a feather navigate a hurricane. She looked so small, so fragile against the imposing dark wood of the court. A special lower chair had been placed for her, but it still seemed to swallow her whole. As instructed, George led Barney to a spot on the floor beside the stand, just out of the jury's direct line of sight. Barney lay down, resting his head on his paws, a silent, golden guardian. And then the waiting began. The silence stretched for 1 minute, then 2. It was an eternity. Lily just sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Sarah Jenkins. The prosecutor stood at her podium, her expression patient, but inside her heart was hammering against her ribs. Thorne, the defense attorney, began to smile. He slowly started gathering his papers, a non-verbal signal to the jury that this was exactly the waste of time he predicted. The case was imploding before their very eyes. Sarah knew she had to act, but one wrong move could shatter Lily's fragile state. She approached slowly, her voice soft. "Hi, Lily," she said gently. "Can you tell us your name?" Silence. "Lily, do you see your friend Barney down there?" Silence. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. The judge shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed. It was over. All of it. The fight, the legal precedent, the hope it was all for nothing. But then something shifted. It was a movement so small, almost everyone missed it. Lily's small hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly unfurled. She reached down her arm, disappearing over the side of the witness box. Her tiny fingers found their way into the thick, soft fur of Barney's neck. She wasn't petting him. She was anchoring herself. You could see her small shoulders rise and fall with a single deep breath. And that's when she looked up. Not at Sarah, not at the judge, but at the jury. Sarah tried again, her voice barely a whisper. "Lily, can you tell us what happened that night?" Lily didn't answer. Instead, she did something that made the entire courtroom gasp. She leaned forward right over the edge of the witness box until her face was close to Barney's ear. And she began to whisper. It was inaudible, a secret shared between a girl and her dog. Thorne shot to his feet. "Objection! Your Honor, the witness is... I don't even know what she's doing. She's conferring with the dog. This is a circus." Judge Marcus looked down, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and frustration. But before he could rule, Sarah Jenkins saw her opening. It was a wild, desperate, one-in-a-million chance. "Lily," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Can you tell us what you just told Barney?" Thorne yelled, "Objection, hearsay. She's repeating her own statement, Mr. Thorne." "It's not hearsay." The judge snapped, his eyes now fixed on Lily. His curiosity piqued. "Overruled. The witness will answer the question." The room fell silent once more. Everyone leaned forward. Lily sat back up in her chair. She looked at Sarah, and for the first time her voice, though small and trembling, echoed through the courtroom's microphones. "I told him," she said, her voice as clear as a bell, "that he didn't have to be scared anymore." A wave of confusion washed over the room. Sarah, holding her breath, asked the follow-up question that would change everything. "Why would Barney be scared, Lily?" Lily's eyes drifted from Sarah past the jury and across the room. She didn't look at Richard. Not yet. She looked at the empty space beside him. "Because," she whispered, her voice cracking with a sorrow no child should ever know. "He saw it too. He saw the bad man hurt Mommy." And there it was. The twist that no one, not even Sarah, could have predicted. Barney wasn't just a comfort animal. According to the only witness, he was a second eyewitness. Thorne was apoplectic, shouting objections that the judge was no longer hearing. The jury was frozen, their faces a mask of shock and dawning realization. The legal prop had just been promoted to a corroborating witness. Sarah knew this was the moment. She took a step closer. "Lily," she said, her voice full of a gentleness that belied the power of her question. "Lily, do you see the bad man in the courtroom today?" The seconds ticked by. Each one a hammer blow. Lily's eyes, filled with a terrifying ancient fear, finally moved. They swept across the room, past the bailiffs, past the lawyers, and then they stopped. They stopped on the man with the smug smile, the man who was now staring at her, his face as white as a sheet. Slowly, her small arm lifted. Her finger trembling, but certain pointed directly at the defendant. And the silence was finally broken, not by a whisper, but by a single terrified scream that came from the defendant's own mouth. It was a sound that didn't belong in a courtroom. Not a word, not an objection, but a raw, guttural scream of pure, cornered panic. Richard's scream tore through the stunned silence, a confession more damning than any signature on a dotted line. In that single, horrifying moment, the mask of the calm, smug defendant didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. Chaos erupted. The jury gasped, some recoiling in their seats, as if they'd been physically struck. Marcus Thorne. The defense attorney stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. The fortress of legal arguments he had so carefully constructed had just been obliterated by a single primal scream from his own client. He looked at Richard not with the eyes of a lawyer, but with the betrayed stare of a man who just realized he'd been defending a monster. "Order, order in this court!" Judge Marcus's gavel hammered down like cannon fire, his voice thundering through the room, trying to pull the proceedings back from the brink of collapse. The bailiffs were already moving their hands on their weapons as Richard, now sobbing and babbling incoherently, was restrained at his table. And this is a powerful lesson in the nature of truth. We build such complex defenses for our lies, don't we? We construct walls of alibis, justifications, and counter-narratives. But the truth especially, the truth spoken by a child, is simple. It's a single sharp stone, and sometimes all it takes is that one small stone to bring the entire fortress of lies crashing down. Richard's mind hadn't been broken by a clever legal argument. It had been broken by the simple, unwavering point of a 4-year-old's finger. The judge, seeing the state of the defendant and the undisguised shock on the jury's faces, made a swift decision. "The jury will be escorted to the deliberation room," he announced, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And Mr. Thorne," he added, his gaze like ice, "for the record, the court recognizes your client's outburst as a spontaneous declaration." It was legal speak for what everyone in the room already knew he had just confessed. The deliberation was expected to take hours, maybe even days. But less than 20 minutes later, a bailiff re-entered the courtroom. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." A shockwave went through the room. 20 minutes. They didn't need to debate. They just needed to sign the paperwork. The jury filed back in, their faces grim, their eyes avoiding the defense table completely. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with trembling hands, was handed the verdict form. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the paper in her hands. She cleared her throat and spoke the word that had been hanging in the air, the word that Lily had fought through her silence to deliver: guilty. The word landed, and for a moment there was nothing. And then a sound. A quiet sob of relief from Clara, Lily's mother, as she crumpled into her seat. A long, shuddering exhale from Sarah Jenkins, as the weight of the last 3 months finally lifted from her shoulders. The legal battle was over. The monster was caged. Justice had been served. But amidst the quiet tears and relieved embraces, the story's most important moment was happening almost unnoticed. Lily didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at her mother. She didn't seem to register the verdict at all. Instead, she slid off her chair, turned away from the chaos of the human world, and buried her face in the warm golden fur of her silent protector. She wrapped her tiny arms around Barney's neck and just held on her small body, shaking not with fear, but with release. Barney, sensing her need, didn't move. He just let out a soft sigh and leaned into her embrace, a solid living anchor in her storm. And in that moment, we see the most profound lesson of all. For an adult, victory is justice. It's a guilty verdict. But for a child who has seen the worst of humanity, Victory isn't about punishment. It's about safety. It's about finally feeling secure enough to let go. Barney wasn't a key to a testimony. He was a key to her healing. The verdict had closed the case file, but it had just opened a new chapter for Lily and Barney. A chapter that would prove their bond was forged, not just in trauma, but in a love so profound it would inspire an entire community. And it all started with an unspoken promise made in a sunlit room. A promise to be a safe harbor, no matter what came next. The slam of the gavel provides an ending, but it doesn't provide closure. A verdict can cage a monster, but it can't undo the monster's work. For the adults in the room, the story was over. But for Lily, the guilty verdict wasn't an ending. It was the first terrifying step into a world she no longer knew how to trust. The real work, the quiet, painstaking work of healing, had just begun. In the weeks that followed, the silence returned to Lily's life. Not the frozen, fearful silence of the courtroom, but a hollow, empty silence that filled their small home. Nightmares ripped her from sleep, leaving her trembling in the dark. Clara, her mother, did everything she could, but she was trying to mend a wound she couldn't see. And then George started bringing Barney for visits. At first it was just for an hour a day. Barney would simply lie on the living room floor while Lily watched him from a distance. Then one afternoon, after a particularly bad night, Lily fell asleep on the couch. When she woke up, it wasn't to a nightmare, but to a warm, heavy weight on her feet. Barney had moved from the floor and rested his head on her legs as she slept. He had stood guard over her dreams. From that day on, he never left her side. The true breakthrough came on a crisp autumn afternoon in their backyard. George tossed a worn-out tennis ball. Barney, in a burst of joyful energy, bounded after it, his golden fur flying. And for the first time in months, a sound bubbled up from Lily's chest. It was small, fragile, but unmistakable. A laugh. Clara froze, tears instantly welling in her eyes. It was the sound of her daughter coming back to life. Barney had done what no therapist or lawyer could do. He had reminded her what joy felt like. But the story's impact rippled far beyond that backyard. Judge Marcus, the stern-by-the-book jurist, became the most vocal advocate for the courthouse dogs program in the state. He spoke at legal conferences not about the legal loophole he'd found, but about the moral obligation of the justice system to find a way to listen to its most vulnerable witnesses. The local news story about the Golden Witness was picked up by national outlets. Donations poured into the foundation, enough to train and place 3 new dogs in courthouses that had never had them before. The story of one little girl's courage and one dog's loyalty had started a quiet revolution. Perhaps the most surprising ripple was a single anonymous donation for $5,000. George only found out later through a discreet source that it came from a bank account belonging to Marcus Thorne, the defense attorney. Some victories, it seems, can even change the people who fought against them. But the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the bank accounts. It was in the quiet finality of a promise kept. Seeing that Barney's true purpose was no longer in a courthouse, but at Lily's side, the foundation made an unprecedented decision. They retired him from service. On a sunny afternoon, Clara and Lily officially adopted Barney. He wasn't a courthouse dog anymore. He was family. If you were to walk past their house today, you might see them. A young girl, a little taller now, her laughter no longer a surprise, but a constant melody in the air. And beside her, an old golden retriever, his muzzle a little grayer, his steps a little slower, but his eyes still fixed on her with the same unwavering devotion. He is her shadow, her guardian, her constant reminder that even after the deepest darkness, the sun will rise again. He didn't just help her speak. He taught her how to live again. The story of Lily and Barney is a powerful reminder, isn't it? A reminder that the most important courtroom battles aren't always about guilt or innocence, but about fear and safety. It shows that sometimes the key to healing isn't a person at all, but a loyal friend with 4 paws and a heart of pure gold. We create these stories because we believe in the power of connection, both human and animal. And now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had an animal in your life that did more than just listen? A pet who became a protector, a healer, or a silent confidant during a difficult time? Please share your story in the comments below. We read every single one, and your stories inspire us all. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel grow, and be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss another story of hope, courage, and the incredible bonds that shape our lives. Thank you for being here with us.